Hello and welcome to Fountainhead, brought to you by WebEngage. Fountainhead is a consolidation of all of our education, ecosystem, and community efforts. As the first initiative under this umbrella, the Fountainhead Leadership Series aims to bring to you the best of industry leaders to share actionable insights, tricks of the trade, and to answer all of your nuanced questions. So ready to get inspired and entertained? Let's go.
Hi and good morning, everyone, on yet another edition of the Fountainhead Leadership Series. In keeping with our promise to keep it exciting, we today have Alok, who's a seasoned entrepreneur now. I think 15 years is pretty long in India's startup ecosystem. We can pretty much be called one of the super early starters before even it was truly fashionable to running a startup in India. And it's been a very interesting journey, ups and downs, near-death experiences, and it's survived, they've thrived, and they're headed for an IPO soon. So that's one share I'm going to for sure invest in. But without taking a lot of time, Alok, thank you so much for doing this with us. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Ankur. It's a delight to be here.
So our intent really tends to be around having conversations on the whole idea of building a resilient long-term business, and Exigo is like a testimony to all of that. So I could go into the details of your journey maybe, but that would mean an hour is going to fall short. So maybe I'll just stick with some specific areas of your journey which you can delve deeper into. And the first that comes to me is the choice of industry. Was that a conscious one? Because travel is not an easy business to be in.
Well, I think travel is and continues to be one of the most interesting and eventful industries from the perspective of, as a traveler, it's actually one of the things you really look forward to. It's an experiential category. It's not a category which is only about selling tickets. Some people mistake it as that, but this category is really about how do you, make sure you're there for the traveler right from the time they start thinking of a trip till the time they're actually in the trip, or after the trip if they run into some problems. So I think we've tried to look at this category more holistically, at least at Ixigo. And our excitement comes from the fact that travel is, one of the few things in life that you actually spend on, but you get richer as a result of that. Right. So,
Sure.
and
That's a nice way of
reading
looking
books
at it.
will probably be the other one. But so I think being able to create that impact in people's lives, being able to bring joy to families and friends who are out there experiencing the world, I think that's very fulfilling as founders in this category. And of course, there is still so much to improve in this category, which is what keeps us here, despite having been there for so long. And this constant evolution, which we'll talk about later today. But there's so much going on out there, especially in India. There is still so much to be done for the traveler.
Awesome. That's very interesting. So, 15 years is a long journey. Did it at some point get tiring? And how do you recharge? How do you keep the energies?
Yeah, it's a good question. When founders start out, they think in their head this is going to be a 5 to 10 year long journey, right? And you start that journey with some assumption that there is an end game, right? And you're kind of running towards that end game. But over time, at least for us, what we've realized is that, while you're in the journey and while you're experiencing the things happening in the journey is the most exciting part. It's not the start or the end that you're always thinking about, but it's also the constant challenges that you face where you learn things by doing them. Sometimes you fall flat and you learn to pick yourself up again. I think those are key learnings, not just for startup life, but for life in general, which we're very fortunate to have had. And you reach a point where you ask yourself, would you be doing anything different the next day, right? And or would you be excited to go back to doing what you were doing yesterday, and do it even better? And I think for us, the answer has always been, the same, that we are enjoying what we are doing. The customers that we are serving, love us enough to keep coming back and help us grow. And, there's no point kind of putting an end game or end line to this, because I think till the time companies believe, they have their potential is more than what their resources are, right? You keep working like a startup, right? And working like a startup is always exciting. And for us, that hasn't changed over the last 15 years.
But that's what I was wondering. Isn't it also a bit tiring with all that intensity slash what do you call it, passion and everything? I mean, you can maintain a certain velocity for some time, but you can't do this for that long. That's what I was wondering. How do you either recharge, or have you chosen a slightly more conscious space to smell the roses, as you put it?
Yeah, I think, look, there have been phases in the journey where the intensity has been more or less. There's been more competitive intensity at certain points. There have been situations where we obviously had near that experiences or ran out of money. And in those moments of truth, right, if the conscious decision as a team, not just founders but the entire team, is to continue soldiering on, right, it makes the company so much resilient that you believe that that's what you're cut out for, right, beyond a certain point. And in
Hmm.
Ixigo's case, right, we were in a very competitive industry. We were not the most funded player. We were not the largest player on any metric for many years, right? But we were the player that were able to evolve fastest to change, right? And
Hmm.
I think, going back to the Darwinian view of the world, right, the species that survive and succeed are the ones that can change fast enough, right? And I think, look at our journey. We started as a meta search. We were searching tickets at one place and allowing you to find where they are. We were not selling anything to you. On the train side, we started as a utility app, so we were just giving train information, PNR status, running status, all of that. None of that made money, right? But people loved it, right? Like, people
Yeah.
love to find an app that actually thought of all the problems, all the small, tiny problems that every train traveler in the country was facing, suddenly got solved in this app. And we started seeing massive growth coming in, right? And on the flight side, we realized beyond a certain scale that we got to be full stack. So we kind of went
Hmm.
and became an OTA. In the last 3 years, we evolved into an OTA from a meta. And I think it's these phases of evolution. Like, we started web first, there was no mobile. Today, like, most of our traffic and bookings come from our apps, right? And I think the ability to kind of constantly evolve and adapt to the market without running out of cash and without running out of steam. More importantly, you
I
might
was
run out
about
of
to add
cash.
that.
you We did run out of cash 3 or 4 times,
Yeah.
but we didn't
Yeah.
run out of steam.
Hmm.
I think that came through what you said, smelling the roses or smelling the flowers along the way in the journey, enjoying those moments and taking them in your stride rather than kind of just hanging up the boots and
Hmm.
giving up at those points. I think that's what has brought us here.
Very interesting. So, there's so many in the rearview mirror now, right? Lots of attempts have been made in this space. They came, they disrupted the space, maybe increased the competitive intensity, and then they disappeared. So, is it your resilience that you would credit for having survived all those assaults or whatever you call them on the market, that people are getting aggressive with their funding, with their discounting? And travel is not a space where you have a lot of loyalty as such. People travel relatively infrequently, and then they don't necessarily have a strong top of the mind recall, but you seem to be able to build that loyalty where people will stay with you for their multiple travel needs and some amount of content play as well. So what would you credit
Yeah, so
as?
I think I think you got to choose your battles, right? As a startup, you got to choose your battles, because some people are in the battle for growth, right, and growth at all costs,
Hmm.
and not caring about the bottom line and throwing everything they have at the problem to get market share. And we have seen, anecdotally, right, that these companies tend to get into a self-destructive cycle, right? There are certain there are certain there are certain cons of chasing growth at all cost, and those cons can be detrimental in the longer term, right? Cons
Hmm.
like, are you focusing enough on culture, right? Are you able to build the right financial discipline? Are you able to have enough checks and balances in place that you're not doing things that you're not supposed to, right? And I think in our case, we've taken conscious calls many a times, even when we had the capital, that we do not want to be in that rat race. where we are chasing growth at all costs, right? And it's a conscious decision for every company. And it sometimes is a very difficult decision because you have your competitors chasing growth, they're taking market share away, they're throwing money at customers. But then you realize that are they solving the problems and pain areas of the customers as deeply as you are, right? And so long as you believe that you can do that better than them, it doesn't matter how much money they throw at customers, right? You just have to be there for the customers with a long-term commitment. And that long-term commitment means at times doing things which are right for the customer and may seem not so intuitive for you as a founder. And I'll tell you, last year when COVID happened, a lot of airlines had not given refunds on time, right? And customers, obviously, customers were expecting their refunds. They were actually in a double whammy situation, right? Because they didn't have money. Some of them lost jobs, or they had salary cuts, and some OTA or some airline sitting on X amount of money. And we took a very conscious call and refunded a lot of customers proactively before we got the money back from the airlines, right? It was not a great call for our bottom line or balance sheet, right? But we took that call knowing in full faith that if you treat a customer right during a crisis, I don't think he or she is ever going to forget that, right? And the first thing they'll do when things are better is probably come back to you over anybody else, right? And I think we've made several such things along the journey where we said, look, this is the right thing to do. It may not be the best thing to do from a P&L standpoint, but it's the right thing to do for the customer, right? And as long as you're building your company that way, we have seen that the longer term people do value it. People do come back to it because your competitor's customer is only one bad experience away from coming to you. That's how I put it.
So you basically just play it out, stick around, stay long enough, deliver a great experience, and people will falter, people will make mistakes, and that mistake is your opportunity in some sense. While of course, I'm pretty interested about these choices you've made across multiple steps, where you said you've chosen the good things over the necessarily financially right things. And is this something that is now a part of the DNA of the company somewhere? Because is it your own decision? Does it happen at multiple levels? Because I'm sure these things percolate at multiple levels, right?
Yeah, so I think culture is something that subconsciously, me and Rajneesh as founders have focused a lot on since our early days. We never had posters hanging in our walls saying these are our cultural values and attributes. In fact, the first time we wrote this down is 3 years ago, and we retrospectively said, okay, what have we been doing? Like if we ask a random exegem, to define our culture, what are the words they would use? So we did those thought experiments. We also spoke to people, and then we wrote down, there were a few cultural values which we came across, right? And at the top there was empathy, right? It's something that we'd always been testing a lot during interview process on, because we believe fundamentally, if you want to build the best customer experience, if you want to build a good team culture, you need empathy. And we were talking about empathy back when it was not sexy to talk about it. COVID made it even more attractive to talk about it. But I think we've been talking about this since 2008. So in 2008, we ran out of money. We had a term sheet from a leading investor that collapsed just before the Lehman crisis. And we were left in the lurch where we could either let everybody go, or everybody would have to take a deep salary cut. And I remember one of our junior engineers in this small town hall we did with 25 people, he stood up and said, we can all work without salary for a year. What's the big deal? Right? And that sort of started this whole discussion in the room that allowed us to create a plan that would help us survive with everybody taking like a 50-60% pay cut. And in moments like those, you realize that it's that empathy that those people felt for each other and for the company, right? Which really helped it survive. Because if everybody was to their own, I'm sure they were all bright people. This guy was from IIT, he could have found a job elsewhere. But I think building that empathy for the team, for the customer, and our customers, I'll give you a few examples of empathy there as well. Like there are many times where as a team, we have come together and done the right thing. Like in COVID, the number of calls that we were getting for reschedules and cancellations and information shot through the roof. Like we were getting 8 to 10x of the customer reach outs compared to normal times during the peak. Nobody can hire that many customer support people in the short term, right? Our entire team was doing customer support. All 100 and X people that we were, like I think 150 people, we were all doing customer support for almost 8 to 10 days, right? Because we were like,
Nice.
we should not have anybody feel that they couldn't talk to us, right? Whether it was through email, through chat, through calls, we all were there. And there was this particular weekend I recall where our refund account on the PG, because normally you collect more cash than you refund, right? But during COVID, the opposite happened. You were refunding 10x as much cash as you were collecting. In fact, you were collecting
Sure.
zero because the
Yeah,
booking
because no new
was
bookings.
stopped. So our PG ran into a negative balance, which had to be resolved, and our current account did not have enough money. We had to break some investments, but breaking investments takes one T plus one, right? You don't
Yeah,
get the money
yeah,
instantly.
yeah.
So all Exigems came together, pooled in our own money into an account, and refunded customers that day,
Wow.
right? Like, and these stories become stories you tell new Exigems
Yeah,
who join the
exactly. These are
company.
stories to
It
tell,
becomes
right?
like folklore. It's a folklore right now.
Yep, yep.
But we've been through these things that shaped culture, right? So the culture has been built by decisions we took, by not just saying things, but actually saying, okay, empathy means you put the customer first, you put your teammate first. It's not about you, and you live it through your decisions. And I think one more I would want to talk about is that when COVID struck and the lockdown was announced, nobody knew how long this thing will last, right? And zero revenue scenarios nobody models. So as
Yeah,
founders, we lost a lot of sleep that particular
of
week.
course.
Like I think for 4 days, Rajnish and I would have slept not more than 4 hours each day. And we were like, what will we do if this lasts for like 6 months, 8 months? Because we didn't have the cash to survive more than that if there was zero revenue, right?
Yeah,
Um, but we went back to our team, and the team was like, why don't we think about all the other ways we can monetize our user base and do this and that, and we were like, look, we are depressed and not getting sleep here, and these guys, they're all saying, oh, there are ways to salvage this situation. And then you realize that this organizational resilience has gotten built because they've seen a few crises before. They've seen
yeah,
that nothing lasts forever. And people are always looking now to how do we capitalize this when the times are better. And through the team's efforts, we came up with this product called Ixigo Assured, which now gives you a full refund if you cancel for whatever reason, because that was the biggest problem we found out during that time.
yeah.
So we used the downtime, the 2 months when there was no business, to actually build a new product. Right. And the
Wow.
idea for that, the inspiration for that came from our own teammates, and what we strongly felt for, saying, look, we need to build something in this downtime. We can't just be sitting here twiddling our thumbs.
Yeah.
And I think these become then stories to tell for generations. If you're
Yeah,
building a
they get it
generation,
ingrained in the DNA that much more. And I was actually going
yeah.
to wonder, yeah, this whole retaining this culture would have meant some hard calls also at some point, potentially saying no to an investor, potentially letting go of some critical employees. What was those side like?
Yeah, so actually the hard call in this lockdown situation was not letting go of the employees. Letting go of the
Sure.
employees was the obvious thing to
Yeah,
do,
the
which
easier one.
most companies out there were doing it. I think we had a hard time convincing ourselves that it's the wrong thing to do in this situation, because ultimately it was a humanitarian crisis, right?
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
not
yeah.
just it was not just a financial crisis. So we took this decision that, look, there are two scenarios. Scenario one, we do not survive after 6 months or 8 months, right? If the lockdown continues, in that scenario, why would you let anybody go? Scenario two, things come back after 3 months, 4 months, and hopefully travel bounces back in a way that has, I mean, never seen before, right? Because people would be fed up of staying at home. Obviously, we didn't know it would last for 2 years, but then we were like, in both scenarios, why would you let people go,
How does it matter? It
right?
doesn't
Because
change
it
anything.
does matter, right? And you needed more people because customer support had
Yeah.
reached epic proportions, right? So we were like, look, at this time we need people. We actually hired, so just to share, I don't think we've shared this with most people, but we hired a few people during COVID, on our
Wow.
customer support team. Not that the team did not sacrifice; the entire team took a very deep pay cut.
Sure.
And mostly voluntary. The leadership team took like 60-70% pay cut. Most of our other folks took like a 40% pay cut, and it lasted for a good 4 to 5 months, right?
Hmm.
But I think the big thing for us really is that sometimes you have to do things which are not the most obvious thing to do in these situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, did you have to let go of somebody who turned out to be not so empathetic in the cultural fit? I mean, how do you
Yes,
assess somebody for these things in your interview process? It can only go so far. So that's the another hard part of these kind of culture, maintaining this kind of culture, right? So
yeah. So I
constantly
think
watch to maintain that it
I,
doesn't get diluted.
yes. So I think if you break down empathy, right, into a few more attributes, it boils down to things like some level of humility, ability to listen to others, ability to understand the problems that others are facing, right, and the will to go the extra mile to help others out, right.
Hmm.
Now, the moment you break it down into these four things, you can come up with interview questions that can test these, right? Because listening skills, you can talk about things and then ask back, what the candidate actually heard. You can ask for situations where they've gone out of their way to help someone in their team, right?
Hmm.
If it's a customer support person, you can ask them. I actually, my favorite question to a customer support rep is, when was the last time you did not follow the process, but you helped the customer beyond what the
Hmm.
process told you to? Right?
Hmm.
And have you ever done that? Because
Hmm.
many a times the process will not tell you the best thing to do for the customer, right? It will just tell you to read a boring script. But there
Yeah.
are situations where you have to create exceptions, right? And I ask people, have you ever created exceptions which
Hmm.
were right for the customer? Right now,
Hmm.
there are ways you can test these things, right, the moment you break
Hmm.
them down.
And what
And
did it do to
during
your hiring funnel? Yeah, sure. Please complete.
one thing it does is that it slows down our hiring a bit, because till date, Rajneesh or me interviews in the last round for every person we hire,
Okay.
and and some of the things we test for is largely this cultural traits and
Yeah.
attributes from a fitment
Hmm.
perspective. But just going back, you're right that you also need to create examples on the other side where somebody who was not being a great cultural fit, what did you do
Hmm.
about that, right? And in the past, yes, we have let a couple of people go when they were not living up to these values, right? And I think the longer you tolerate them in the system, the more you are creating the wrong example. So I think you have to
Diluting the
take those tough calls.
culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Did that also happen with the investors that you, I mean, because a lot of people expect a very, I don't know, tactical way of doing things, which is not necessarily in sync with what you care about or what you believe in. And did that mean some hard calls on that front as well at some point?
Um, I think thankfully we've had very supportive investors
Yeah.
who have trusted our judgment, right, on these things. And I think over time they have seen that our judgment has not been
Hmm.
something not. I mean, it might seem incorrect for the short term, but for the long
Sure.
term, it has usually turned
It
out to be
was.
the right thing to do, right? So I think thankfully we've not faced situations where our investors were not in line with the decisions we were taking, and I think one thing I will say is that not everything is about bottom line, but the best way to build bottom line is to focus on those things.
Yeah, exactly. So, at
Yeah.
a personal level, Alok, do you invest any kind of effort in coaching? How did you build these traits around patience? For example, you've had a 15-year journey. That's not an easy one.
Yeah.
A lot of people would run out. So, in terms of your patience, in terms of the resilience, what was, in terms of the habits and the strengths that you have had to develop over this period, what was your
Right.
model, playbook, framework like?
Yeah, so I think you always need to have a constant, big, hairy, audacious goal that the company is chasing at all times, right?
Hmm.
Because I think the excitement for somebody who wakes up and goes to work, or logs into work these days, is essentially, what are we chasing, right? And having a North Star metric that everyone has, including for the entire company, has been critical. And as leaders, communicating that and making sure everyone understands that, and to the extent where you're talking not just in a town hall but also one on one with certain people at a certain frequency. I think it's very important to reinforce that messaging around why we are building what we are building and why we believe we have a right to win, right? And because it's like when you lead troops to a war, right? They need to believe that they're on the right side of that
Yeah.
particular crisis, and because otherwise they have no motivation to fight, right? And startups are no different, right? So the will to continue doing it despite the fact that at that time you might be a tiny company in the ecosystem and nobody knows you, you don't have a lot of funding. I mean, we've lived through all that in our early years, bootstrap. Our series A round happened 5 years after we started, right? And during that time you will have existential crisis where people will say, why are we doing this, right? And you just have to go back to that look, if we say we want to build the best customer experience in this category, first of all, we believe that it still doesn't exist, and second, if we believe we can build it, we have the right people, the right resources, and the right kind of history to build that, then let's continue doing that, right? Let's not worry about all this noise out there, because the noise, we've seen noise has a cycle, right? The noise goes up, noise goes down. But if you are unwavering in your execution towards your vision, you should just focus on that, focus on the customer, solve their problems, deliver value, do the right things for your team, for the customer, and in the long term, you can't go wrong with those things. I mean, yeah.
Fair enough. So, do you use a coach as a concept? Do you like the idea of having a coach? Because some of these things would be overwhelming.
Yeah, I like the idea of having a coach. I didn't have any, let's say, one particular coach, but at times, I have tapped into the, when I got stuck with something, certain strategic decision, or a conversation with an investor, etc. Like I would, I had quite a few mentors who I did reach out to time along the journey, and I remain thankful to them. I think it's very important because
Yeah.
there are so many people out there who have a lot more experience and a lot more, I would say, a very different perspective of looking at things. Like you might feel that you are in the worst situation out there, but somebody else might come and tell you it's not such a bad situation. They've seen worse, right? And
Yeah.
and you kind of then have more optimism. So I think it's important to have somebody like that to speak to, whether it's a full-time coach or whether it is a set of
A
people
set of
you can reach
mentors.
out to. Yeah, yeah.
Fair enough. So, on the operational side of the business, now you've had a fairly long journey. You've seen people come in, go out, go aggressively. Would it be fair to say that you've had always the deepest consumer insights? Because what consumers truly care about and would come back for is the part that a lot of people tend to miss when they're rushing through the acquisition process or the growth process. Is that something that you've paid conscious attention to learning systematically as a company?
Yeah, um, I think getting too wedded to one idea, right, for a very long time, uh, in today's world is a far bigger risk, right?
Hmm.
Because if you believe you're on the right track and you spend years just trying to prove to yourself that you're on the right track, whereas the market is moving elsewhere. So I think figuring out where the puck is going to move to next, as they say, uh, at Ixigo, we always spend a lot of time as founders thinking about that, right?
Hmm.
Maybe it's just a cultural trait now, but right from the beginning, we were a bit ahead of times in what we were thinking and launching. We were the first to market with a meta search, the first to market with a train app, a utility app, the first to market with flight fare predictions, train PNR predictions, many other such innovations. We may not be the only ones in the market today with that, but we are proud that we were the
You were the
first to
first ones.
market
Yeah.
because we thought of them because of these fundamental consumer insights, right? Or
Yeah.
even Exigo assured for that matter, right? So I think the only way to do that, and this is what I tell my PMs and even business people, that look, we got to spend a lot more time with the customers,
Hmm.
talking to customers, listening to customers. I still tell all my leadership folks that every single one-star review that we get on Play Store needs to be read by all of us,
Yeah.
right? Because that's where the insights are hidden.
Hmm.
um, and some of the 5 stars as well, for that matter. But some of the feedback that we get, we as founders personally respond to them. I'm still, even at this scale, involved sometimes in cases where the customer, we need to go out of our way to help a customer. You will see me actively on Twitter responding to customers even
Yeah,
to
I
date.
have seen that.
And that has become part of the entire company's DNA, saying that, look,
Hmm.
if we tell ourselves we put customers first and we are customer obsessed, let's prove it through our actions, right from
Hmm.
the top to the bottom. And coming back to what we're talking about, basically, uh, I think how deeply you observe customers in their natural habitat, as in while they're actually. So I have done train journeys where I've only sat and observed, and I still travel by train whenever I get an opportunity to, just to observe, what do people want, like how do they use these apps. If they're using a competitor app, why are they using it, what are they using it for, right? If they're
Hmm.
using our app, what are they actually clicking on, because I might assume they click on this, but they might not, right? So um, I think that deeply observant curiosity, and the curiosity of knowing what you don't know, that cultural trait is very important to preserve. And one thing we are realizing, and we've also made our mistakes in this, but if you are only chasing growth and you have a lot of high intensity pressure to just chase growth, and be answerable to moving a certain metric, it can kill some of the uh, pause you need to sit and observe things, right? To talk to people, to actually get some of the softer insights, to go out there and meet some of these customers, or actually play around with other apps, right? At times in your free time, right? So, but that needs some mental space and bandwidth. That needs some time. That needs attention, right? It cannot be done in an environment where growth at all costs is the only thing that matters. So our belief is that the moment you are wandering, there is serendipity, there are discussions which do not have an agenda. Those are moments in which innovative things come out, right? Innovation cannot be done with a meeting request where you already have an agenda and an objective aligned in it, right? Those are very important for incremental growth. I'm not saying
Sure.
I'm against that. At this scale,
Hmm.
most of our meetings are like that. But I think it's important to step back and smell the roses, understand what the customers are doing, understand what their pain areas are, go and try to solve for them better than anybody else has ever thought of.
But that's the little irony here, right? Given the way the ecosystem has been for the last few years, and you've seen these ups and downs, and probably this is yet another phase for you. But the way things are in the last few years, at least the people who've recently raised meaningful amount of money, the culture is not something that they're able to really pay as much attention to. Perhaps maybe it's a lack of conviction, maybe it's a lack of bandwidth. But that's where I'm tend to get concerned that these are things which take their own sweet time to nurture and build, and nobody has the time. So how do you address this in a scenario? A founder who's probably got a million bunch of dollars in his bank, he wants to go aggressively because in 18 months he has to get to a certain level and he has a certain deliverables to meet. How do you navigate this scenario with the kind of philosophy you're talking about?
Look, don't get me wrong. I think growth is important. Growth
No, I'm
motivates
not
the
saying
entire
growth is
team,
not.
right?
I'm sure Ixigo's grown
Yeah. So I'm
manifold
just
as well.
saying, yes. So I mean, we have been growing despite COVID, right? And I think
Sure.
it's important that people understand what is driving that growth. It's look, it's very easy to spend a lot of money on marketing and deliver growth and be happy about it.
Hmm.
Whereas it's very hard to actually get real growth coming due to some fundamental product innovation, or uh, app search optimization, search engine optimization, things that take time, and a lot of effort, which fructifies over months or years, or even content marketing innovation. Like, we spend a lot of time just making
Yep.
random videos, no agenda. We have these brainstorms with Ashish Chopra, who heads that team. I mean, we
He's
we
a
come up
celeb in
with
that Indian
random
marketing
stuff.
space now.
Yeah, so we come up with really random stuff, right? And at times, that just works, right? So that's how I put it. That's it's not like every video is a viral on the day we think about it. But some of that comes from these serendipitous discussions I was talking about. Like, you're just talking about some random trend out there, and you're like, why can't we build a video around this, right? And you start just working on that. It's not slotted into the calendar. There is no deadline for it, right? But it still happens, and it's
Still
amazing,
happening.
right? So so I think I think what's important is to have maybe like a 80-20 window, right? So growth startup, 80% of your time should still be devoted to that iterative stuff and growth stuff, and like constantly chasing that metric that needs to keep moving up, and deadlines and timelines and releases and all of that, which is important. It's the stuff that keeps the bread and butter coming in, right? Basically puts the money on the table. But you need to carve out that 20% time that needs to be, whether it is no meetings. Some companies are saying no meetings during this time, right? And they will block the calendars of all the creators in the company, whether it's developers or designers, that nobody can meet you during that time. I think it's a good
Yeah.
idea. We've just started doing this as well. So 3 days a week, 3 hours a day, no meetings, right? For people who are creators, essentially. And because you can't come up with new stuff in a deadline environment.
With the meeting.
I can't put a gun to your head and say come up with a new feature in an hour, right? That doesn't happen. And I think the other part of it is serendipitous brainstorms, where the objective is just to brainstorm about something, right? Like there's no agenda. You're just noting down things people are saying and trying to put it all together, and then figure out if this works, and then you can do your user testing and persona testing and all that later. But there are no ground rules for that discussion. There is no right or wrong answer to anything asked in that discussion. You can say whatever you want without feeling judged about it, right? It's very important to set those ground rules.
Yeah.
That's how innovation happens, right?
You also did mention this whole part, I think, before we started this online, was around the constraints applying to innovate better, right? I mean, the more constraints you operate under, the more necessary it becomes for you to innovate, and perhaps that also helps matters, right? It breeds innovation.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like fishes, right? Fishes don't die if they starve, but they die very quickly if you overfeed them, right? Because that's happened to a lot of companies as well. And we figured out that the one of the reasons why we've been managing to survive despite all these crises is that every time you're in crisis, it's the onus is to fight to survive, find that light at the end of the tunnel, and just run towards it, right? And therefore the urgency to come up with ideas that nobody else has obviously goes up a lot. um, and you're willing to take bigger risks, right? Because the
Yeah,
downside is already visible. So you're
sure.
like, how does it matter? So 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 I think that's what leads to when you're pushed against the wall, that's what leads you to innovate. I mean, if all this entire content marketing that we do started with the idea that, look, we don't have money to buy slots on TV, we don't have money to get
Yeah,
Bollywood celebrities and cricketers and whatnot, how are we going to create our brand? And we said, look, the cheapest way to do that is to actually create content that goes viral on social media platforms, right? And I'm talking 2014,
sure.
2015 here, when we started. Ashish joined us in 2015, I think, and those days nobody was talking about video marketing, right? But we actually started doing that, and it just took off so well. But it was a bet we had to take, because there was no other way to
Yeah,
build our
sure.
brand back then. And even when we do have the capital now to do all those things, we are realizing, look, if it works, why not continue doing this, right?
Why use capital for something you can do without capital? So that's kind of what I would like to zoom into a little bit. You mentioned this indigestion thing, which has become quite a common quote lately, that more companies die of indigestion than they die of starvation, because somewhere the cultural implications of going too fast without investing in this DNA of innovation, of frugality, ends up coming back to bite at some point. And there are funding winters that are bound to come. These are cycles. So if your company has a system is not prepared to kind of thrive in that time, you will end up having a hard journey then. So instead of having a knee-jerk reaction to downsize and all of that, aren't founders better off being more cognizant that this is a natural cycle? So I might as well be more mindful about culture now than growth at all costs and then eventually suffer a year later, because 80% startups are still going to die anyway. That's the reality of it. So and there is, if there is a playbook to kind of apply to say that I will survive no matter what, then probably that playbook is what you guys are talking about.
Yeah, I think, look, the jury is out still on, at least from what we see out there, right? There are a lot of companies in environments where all their competitors are raising big rounds every 6 months, right? And it's
But they
sort of becoming
they'll
an,
eventually go on to self-destruct.
yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm just saying that we've seen this happen in the past, a long time ago in travel, then in e-commerce, then in many other categories where, uh, after seeing this happen at least 3 times in my career, I think we are going through this fourth cycle right now, right? And we might be now at the self-actualization phase finally of that cycle after going through the trough of disillusionment in the last few months.
Hmm.
After the public markets have sort of cooled off, and
Yeah.
certain companies, we are seeing that they're below their last private raise as well, after going public. And uh, I think some of that has to do with, what expectations were you building in for yourself, for your
Hmm.
investors, right? Because as long as you are able to build the right expectations, you can still deliver on those, right? But if you are building hyperinflated expectations on your own performance, you're putting a lot of undue pressure on yourself to
Hmm.
grow at a certain velocity, both in terms of valuation and revenue, and in
Sure.
some cases maybe even there's a profit target. But I'm just saying that if it leads to destruction of culture, destruction of your value system, if it leads to not thinking about the right things for customers but just throwing money at them, then you're not building the right behavior, right? Both as investors and founders, I think we have the onus on ourselves to figure out what behavior we want to encourage in the ecosystem, right? And I think the actions of not just entrepreneurs but also investors play a part in that, because if there are enough investors out there throwing money only at companies which are willing to grow at all costs, it will obviously encourage the behavior where you may not care so much about longer term stuff, because the whole objective is aligned around how do I get to my next round within the next 12 months, right? So I think somewhere I'm already seeing signs of maturity coming in, at least for
Hmm.
companies at scale. Companies which are already either listed or close to being listed, are obviously behaving in a saner manner and saner environment at this point.
I'm glad you use
Um,
that word, sanity.
right. And I do believe that it's a cycle like all other industry or verticals, where we are still at the euphoria phase, where there are 3 or 4 potential winners and all the winners are raising more and more rounds every year. I think at some point, it reaches a point where you figure out that, okay, there are two kinds of players here: one that will survive even after 10 years, even if there's a nuclear holocaust, and then there are players who, as long as there is capital, will continue outpacing everybody else on growth. And as an investor, as a potential employee, you got to bet on where, what kind of company do you want to be part of.
Which is exactly what's the fun fact of today, because you look at these patterns and you're talking about hypergrowth as a mechanism, but it usually ends only one way, and that's the reality of it, right? Because if you've not invested in the right DNA, culture, all these elements that make you resilient to a funding winter, when the winter comes, you will not have the ant and the grasshopper is that story, right? When you're not preparing for the winter, then you will have a hard time in the winter. So I'm just confused that when you look at the investors and entrepreneurs who are probably being euphoric about it, how does they reconcile with the eventual reality? Like, either you have a goal that I'm going to exit in a certain time frame, because ultimately public markets are going to reward good behavior, which is more resilient in nature. Public markets will not reward behavior which is, short-term hypergrowth and then falling apart. So how does that
Yeah,
get
I think, look,
reconciled? What are the goals being chased?
I think the public market has already spoken very clearly. The public market wants to see companies which are either already making money or have a clear path to making money,
Yeah.
right? The public market uh, does not believe in stories where there is a potential path of making money X years down the line, right? Unless there is a clear line of sight on that. And that has happened in the US. We've seen the huge tech correction there. We've seen this in India. And I think the message is loud and clear, right? That you got to, no matter how much scale you have, no matter how big you are in terms of scale, right? Uh, People are going to look at the fundamentals of valuation, which are how will you generate future free cash flow,
Cash flows.
right? And I think the sooner as a founder you start focusing on that, there's a
Yeah,
right time to do that. I mean, I'm not
sure.
saying you need to do that from day one, because there are innovations. Like I told you, when we launched our train app, we didn't know how to make money off it, right? For
Sure.
the longest of time. And that's what happens in most fundamental startup innovations, right? Like it's very hard
Yeah.
to monetize for many years. As long as you're supporting that phase with capital, it's great. I think what people want is companies that can build enough organic traction, right, and to not have to just continue throwing money for growth, right, beyond a certain point. And I think that's the harder problem to solve. That problem cannot be solved overnight. It
Yeah.
takes years to get the product right. It takes years to get the customer acquisition machinery well oiled, to get a lot of organic growth going in, whether it's SEO, ASO. All these problems take years to solve, right? But you
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
be able to budget that time and give it that much time. You want to smell the roses, you have to plant the sapling and wait for whatever time it takes for the roses to emerge, right? So I
Yeah.
think um, I think the learning really is that, look, you have to be able to get to that point where uh, people can see that you are able to either generate cash flows, or you can do that within the next 2 or 3 years. Unless you reach that point, I think for companies to think of going public in this environment may not be a great idea.
Yeah, clearly. So that's where we talk about the whole subject of retention pretty often. That if you don't have your eyes on repeats, then it gets very closely linked to the idea of product market fit. And in your case, I assume that you have a systematic way of looking at what's working and what's not working in terms of driving repeats. And I'm guessing some of these innovations would have also gotten canned because it weren't really getting the right traction, so to speak. So how do you define
Yeah.
traction? How do you decide PMF? How do you decide what to scale, what to withdraw from?
Yeah, so my co-founder Rajneesh puts it this way, that innovation is about solving low ROI problems, right? Because from the outset, when you solve something fundamentally innovative, usually there's like 99% of the time, there's no money to be made in it from day one. If there was, the incumbents would be doing it already, right? If it was so obvious. Why is nobody else doing it? Because people don't find it attractive enough to solve that problem. However, if it is a large enough problem to solve, affects enough number of customers, there will be an ability to monetize it if you actually solve it, right? And
Okay.
time and again, innovative companies, that's how they get created. They solve a problem that people actually desired, but they never told anybody explicitly.
Hmm.
And then they figure out a way to monetize that. Like day one, it's not obvious, but you
Hmm.
figure out a way eventually how to monetize it once you have enough customers, right? So I think we encourage people to solve those customer-centric problems without worrying about monetization on day one,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
However, as we scale, we start thinking, okay, what are the various ways now we can build monetization around this, and don't do it in a way that sort of kills the golden goose before it lays the eggs, right?
Yeah.
But continue to deliver customer value ahead of trying to monetize, right? And the monetization should feel very natural, right? The customer
Hmm.
shouldn't mind paying for that. Like today, if you buy a ticket through Ixigo, we charge a agent service charge for every train ticket booked through us, right? It's actually in most cases, right, a little more than what you would pay on IRCTC, right?
Hmm.
But people don't mind paying that as long as the customer experience that we've built,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, makes them feel that they want to continue using our app, right?
Which is a
So I
great
think,
testament to the whole idea that customers are prepared to pay a little extra for great UX, which is interesting because most people seem to be still using discounts as a great weapon to lure customers in.
yeah, and it's a tough choice, because you will have team members come to you saying, so and so is running so and so offer, what should we do? Are we going to match that? Are we going to counter that? And I'm like, no, we go back and build better customer experience and find ways that people can pay us even more, right? So on flights, what is Ixigo Assured? You end up paying more to protect full refund, free
Yeah.
cancellation, right?
Yeah.
And significant percentage of our customers actually end up paying that, right? So
But so
so we
is
are
this,
trying.
by the way, an
Yeah.
insurance kind of model which you're underwriting, or how is it structured? I mean, airlines don't change their policies. So is it at your
Yeah.
level
So
entirely?
So Ixigo Assured is our own data science and AI led, a fare type that we sell, which is a fully refundable fare type.
Hmm.
Whether the airline gives you a refundable fare type or not, we will give you a Ixigo Assured fare type where you can get a full refund almost instantly.
Hmm.
And the beauty of it is that for 90% of our users, you get the refund back within minutes, right?
Sure.
So the fact of the matter there is that you don't have to wait for the average wait time is like
Sure.
at least 7-8 days even for a regular refund, but in some cases up to a month before you get back your refund in full. During COVID times it was even a few months, right? So I think we've seen that uh, if you build something that customers fundamentally value, you don't need to discount, you can actually charge more.
Which is what is ironic. The 10-minute grocery folks on my phone, while they're very useful, they still end up using a lot of discounts. And like, you're offering convenience, so I'm happy to pay a little extra for it. But if you're going to give me discounts, I won't say no.
I
How do
think
you
there
reconcile
these
with these?
Yeah, I think there's a phase, right? So these companies are in the habit building phase. Travel has been through this phase in the early years, right,
Okay.
where it was all about discounts. Everyone was only talking about discounts, and I think travel has reached this slope of enlightenment of sorts where we are saying, look, and I think food delivery is getting there as well, right?
Yeah.
Like the
Hopefully.
discounts have come off, we've seen. But I think this whole 10-minute delivery space is just getting started. They want to create this habit, they want to
Hmm.
make more and more people aware about their brands. So perhaps the strategy is really to use discounts as a lever for that, but it cannot be the most sustainable lever at scale that is already proven out there.
That's the thing, right? Because where do you draw the line and where do you stop? Because these are endless wars in some sense, and you are both very well-funded companies which are playing it out. As a consumer, I'm happy about it, but it's destructive to value because one, your teams are not getting used to any ideas of innovation apart from
Ankur,
discounts.
the line gets drawn when the taps run dry.
Exactly.
That's when the
And I
lines
mean,
get
we've seen
drawn.
these kind of things before where startups, staffs ran dry and then they ended up having nowhere to go.
Yes, but right now, if you are the flavor of the season, the tap is going to be flowing
But that's a
full
big
for
if, right?
several
If you're a
years.
flavor of the season, I mean, do you really want to leave? Because that's a misalignment of incentives I normally wonder about. For the investor, you're probably one of several bets that he's taking. So he actually is prepared for you to die. I mean, 70 or 80% of his bets will die. That's fine. That's his risk and reward outcome. But as a founder, you only have one boat you're sailing in. And if this one is jeopardized, then it's your only hope that's getting jeopardized, right? So, have you seen that kind of disconnect in some fashion to be the investor interest alignment and your interest alignment being a little mixed up?
I think it's a choice of the battle that you're fighting. If you're
Hmm.
fighting a battle where you believe you can uh, build something the fastest, at whatever cost it needs to be built at, and you're confident you will have enough funding to support reaching a point where the unit economics become positive or sane. Um, there's no harm in doing that as long as but those are two big ifs, right? And I
That's what I
think
was about to ask. The leader facts. I mean,
as a
not to say that
founder,
they were
yeah,
personally
so
at
as a
fault,
founder
but
I think it's always a trade-off, right? So it's always a matter of, look, if you have confidence and that path has like a 80% chance of success versus you not raising any money and operating in a sane manner but having significantly much lesser market share but higher ability to survive. I think it boils down then to what battle are you in personally? What DNA do you have? Is your company and your DNA more aligned towards one versus the other? And in our
But with
case,
the level of
like we
FOMO and that's the word I like to use. Is that so easy to make that choice? Because I might have a DNA for this, but I'm super tempted for this.
look, I don't think there is a right or wrong here. But the only thing I know is
Sure.
that you got to be able to survive to win wars,
Yeah.
right? So
The ball analogy is
so I
amazing.
think so I think it's important. No matter which path you choose, you got to figure out a way to survive.
Yeah, I get that. So I think the whole survival mechanism might be the most interesting piece from this conversation. So we have the last few minutes here, and I thought you might have some message for your 27-year-old ballpark self, right? That's when you started Ixigo, around that time. So if you were to
Yeah.
kind of think back to that day, and some few things that after these 15 years of experience you could tell that guy who's starting out, what would those be like?
Wow.
It's going to be long.
Yeah,
That's one.
this will be long, but uh, I think you shouldn't be shy of thinking big, right? You see, we get constrained by our own mental constraints and roadblocks into how big we want to think, right? I think you should think big. There's no downside of thinking bigger than what you were thinking earlier, right? And having that huge vision, because even if you fail at achieving that, and let's say you end up 20-30% smaller than whatever you were thinking, you will still have built a very large company, right? So
Hmm.
I think in hindsight, like, I would just take bigger and bolder bets ahead of time that we took them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certain decisions that we took along the journey, certain pivots that we made, we could have made them sooner had we taken bigger and riskier and bolder bets.
Sure.
And I think today's youth, what I'm super impressed by is the people who are starting company these days. I see that they're already thinking bigger, thinking bolder. That's what the ecosystem has given us in the last 15 years, that there
Hmm.
is enough mentors out there, enough capital out there, enough role models out there for youngsters to have the confidence to think big, to think global, to think of building generational companies from day one, right?
Hmm.
That's what we need, right? And I think back then, uh, the mindset that most people had was that if you're doing a startup, there's a very high chance of failure, therefore try to do things in a manner where you are not going to be in a situation where you run out of cash very soon, etc., right? And that's how our
Hmm.
DNA also got built over time, because there
Sure.
were hardly four investors in the
Yeah,
country.
hardly anybody.
Today you have an abundance of capital, but I would say that you need to maintain that discipline, right? Which I talked about, that you, no matter how much capital you have available to you, building discipline and building culture has long-term rewards,
Yeah.
right?
Fair. In fact, on that note, I was going to ask you about the whole Amazon statement around one, it's still day one, and second, around the fact that the larger you are, the bigger the experiments have to be. But on the other side, you have these new companies who have a lot of capital, so they kind of and a certain pressure to deploy. So you have these, all of these different parallel experiments and all these different darts you want to throw at the same time, and that goes back to the indigestion topic. How do you reconcile in a steady state for a new age company?
Yeah, like I said, it depends on what stage of the cycle you're at, right? So if
Sure.
you're just starting out, you need to first get your product market fit going, right? And you can't fake it. I mean, it's easy to spend a lot of money on Google and say that you're getting a lot of customers, but I think you got to measure very fundamentally what your net promoter score or your customer satisfaction on existing customers looks like, what your retention is in your very early days. If you don't fix those things, right,
Hmm.
the temptation is to scale ahead of time and try to just grow with very bad cohorts. But that's going to backbite in the future, right? So I would say fix the basics, make sure that your customer has organic love, organic customer repeats, and is able to sustain a certain amount of engagement, right, around it. And only then, it's important then to put some fuel to the fire and
Hmm.
kind of start putting the growth levers in place and start spending money on marketing. Because if you put the cart before the horse, we've seen enough examples of that. that's the most likely scenario for failure.
Yep. On that note, I think the whole indigestion thing, right? PMF not done yet, but multiple city operations already launched, and that's unfortunately a common scenario we still see happening, which is the indigestion story, right? You have the capital, you want to deploy it, you want to expand before you've really sorted your basics and the PMF. Awesome. Any closing remarks, Alok? We've kind of run out of time, so I could go on, but it's been a very interesting and inspiring conversation. At the same time, would anything you would like to close with?
I think we'll just close with the same thing I said earlier, which is survival leads to success. So irrespective of what path you are on, whether it's hyper growth or whether it's more focus on fundamentals, you got to know how you're going to make it on the other side, because the companies that make it on the other side are more likely to win.
Oh, absolutely. Awesome. On that note, thank you so much, Alok, for having come here. It's really interesting and it's really inspiring. We loved hearing you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ankur. Pleasure being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.